Hello and welcome to English 3010 and our introduction to Project 1, Investigating Your Discourse Community. As you might have read in the readings that were assigned for this week regarding John Swales and Ann Johns, both discuss what a discourse community is. For Swales, a discourse community is a group of people with a set of common goals, languages, and interests. And for Swales, he believes that discourse communities are primarily academic discourse communities. So while you may have learned in English 1020 that discourse communities can be communities such as your friends, your band group, people who enjoy playing chess together, and so on, John Swales complicates the idea of a discourse community by indicating that it has primarily to do with professional academics leaning towards a specific goal and group of knowledge. So, John Swales defines a discourse community by having 6 required components to that discourse community for somebody to be a member. For this first requirement, he suggests that a discourse community must be agreed upon a set of common public goals. That means that for you to be an active member in an academic discourse community, you must agree with the other members to what your common public goals are. So for instance, if you are entering into the field of medicine, your discourse community's common public goals, one of many might be to provide health and care to those who are in need or who have diseases. If you're going into the discourse community of a teacher, then your common goals often surround themselves with student learning, achievement, transfer, and so forth. Secondly, a discourse community must have intercommunication among its members. And so this is just a really fancy way of saying that people must communicate with each other, and they have to communicate those goals with each other, otherwise nothing gets done. Number 3 is a discourse community uses its participatory mechanisms primarily to provide information and feedback. So that means, unlike maybe your initial understanding of discourse communities as some being for entertainment or some for being for socialization, Swales' discourse community is very much predicated upon providing and developing information, and that feedback or that communication of the information is most often done through research, writing, conferences, these kinds of things. 4, he says that a discourse community utilizes and possesses one or more genres, and those genres communicate its aims. So, unlike a genre such as horror versus romantic comedy, for Swales and for this course, we see genres as being various different types of communication, again, typically written communication, that will further aims and goals of particular discourse communities. And as you'll see through this project and the rest of the semester, genres and the way that they're written, who they're written to, the information that's placed within those written forms of communication will change and shift depending on the discourse community that is using it. So, for instance, if I'm writing for a discourse community for the field of education, the types of communicative practices that I use will be very much predicated on theory, on pedagogy, on ideas of how students interact and learn, whereas if I were to be writing a type of genre for communication in the medical field, the majority of my written communication is going to be based on scientific inquiry, scientific methods, results, and so forth. 5th, in addition to owning genres, a discourse community has acquired a specific lexis. And I do want you to pay attention to this idea of owning genres, because, in fact, discourse communities do own the genres that they use, and very often they're not used in other discourse communities, only in that discourse community. So if somebody like myself were to go and try to read an academic journal for biomedical engineering, I would really have no idea what type of genre is being used. I would not be able to understand it very well. I would not be able to write in it unless I had been trained to do so. And so one of the things that happens when you go to college is you're asked to write in very specific genres for different discourse communities, often without being given any type of instruction how to do so. So this course is going to help you at least begin to understand the types of genres that are used in various discourse communities, and maybe even learn how to start to write in them as well. But lexis is a very fancy word for saying particular type of speech, or particular type of discourse, or particular type of wording. So again, if somebody were to talk about the lexis in my discourse community, which is literature, many people would say that lit people use very verbose, very complicated, very dense words, and they use them on purpose. And they may not be actually incorrect in that. Whereas somebody who is in the medical sciences, or say a nurse, would use the lexis of saying, for instance, to the doctor that the current patient is under NPO and therefore needs to be monitored. And if somebody didn't work in the nursing community, they wouldn't know what NPO is, but NPO actually means nothing by mouth. So there's very particular types of words and different types of terminologies used that, unless you're a member of a certain discourse community, you may not understand what people are saying. And this is, because discourse communities have very specific knowledge bases. And this brings us to number 6, that a discourse community has a threshold level of members with a suitable degree of relevant content and discursive expertise. Really what Swales is saying here is that to be a part of a discourse community, to be an active member, and to be accepted in that discourse community, you have to have a level of expertise. And you have that level of expertise by understanding the goals, by being able to participate with other members, by being able to write and read and understand the genres that are used in that discourse community, the lexis that is used. And in fact, other discourse communities might even have other types of requirements that indicate whether or not you are a complete member. So for instance, in my discourse community, one of the requirements for somebody to be seen as a true member of our discourse community is to have something published. And until that's done, you may be able to participate in the discourse community, but you're really not seen as a member until that occurs. So we also read Johns, and Johns defines discourse community, but in a much more kind of open, almost kind of participatory and loving way, very different from Swales. So for Johns, he actually defines discourse communities as communities of practice. One of the reasons he does this is because he doesn't see discourse communities as being isolated in the way that Swales does. And in fact, he sees many discourse communities kind of merging into each other, interacting with each other. And a really good example of this would be if you've ever gone to the hospital and you might have the head secretary who's interacting with and talking to the doctor and to the nurse and to the patients and the family members, and actually has a fairly kind of in-depth understanding of some of the terminologies and procedures that are occurring, as well as medical insurance information and so forth. And then the nurses, even though they may not have the same expertise as the doctors, can easily communicate with the doctors, the patients, the family members, and so forth, as are the doctors communicating with everybody else, the family members. And so for Johns, this would be considered a community of practice, where we have very different levels of discourse communities working together towards a common goal, which is to take care of the patient. But he does have some components that he believes are necessary for communities of practice to be in existence. And so he believes that there should be a common theme or purpose. So this is very similar to what Swales says, common goals, right? But he goes further and says there must be trust among the members. And so for real work to happen, trust and kind of collaborative environment must be present. They must be able to share tacit knowledge And tacit knowledge means knowledge that is something that is understood by all. So, for instance, if you're in the discourse community, again, of the medical field, being able to know medical terminologies and the different types of procedures, those are something that everybody should be aware of and everybody should be able to understand and use. They should have a shared practice, so that means, you know, when you go and work with other people in the hospital, for instance, you have very similar procedures. You have to follow those procedures, otherwise something could happen. Everybody follows the same procedures. Interestingly enough, you might go to another hospital and work there, and it may have different procedures, different ways of filling out charts, and so forth. So these shared practices are something that has to be enacted by all. Collective intelligence, that means that everybody should be able to share and understand the same types of knowledge bases, and they should have implicitly held knowledge. And so implicitly held knowledge means knowledge that we just inherently know and believe. So and a good example of this might be, you may know why you have to use the past tense in a certain context when writing, or you may know just implicitly now where to place a comma, but if somebody were to ask you the rules for all of those, right, or the rules for prepositional phrases, or what is a gerund, you would kind of maybe shake your head and be like, I don't know, it just sounds right. And that means that you have implicit knowledge about the types of grammar rules that we use on a daily basis. So this is the same for people that are in discourse communities, and in fact, the longer that they're in those discourse communities, the more that knowledge becomes implicit. It just becomes a part of them. I don't know about you, but I've had many professors in the past who have been very intelligent, very great, but they have kind of taken that implicit knowledge and embedded it so deeply that they really don't know how to teach that knowledge to people anymore, because it's just become so much a part of them that they can't understand why somebody wouldn't know, for instance, you know, the algebraic equation that I have no idea of how to perform. So there can be dangers when people have implicitly held knowledge and it becomes not tacit, which means not shared. Alright, so how does this all relate to Project 1? Project 1 is going to ask you to discover how your discourse community researches, writes, communicates, acts, and thinks. And so what I'm really interested in looking at, and I'm very interested in you finding out, is what kind of research is done in your field. Is it all scientific-based? Is it theory-driven? Is it practice-based? How does somebody write in your discourse community? What we'll find out in this course is that writing is never static. It is always changing, and it's always dependent on who you're writing for, the context you're writing for, the knowledge you're trying to convey. How does your discourse community communicate? And that's not just, you know, verbally, which of course you still might want to look into and see how that works, but what this course is really interested in is the written communication. And two other things that people don't think a lot about, but acting, how one acts in a discourse community and how they think. Those things are influenced by a discourse community that you're a part of, and the longer you're a part of that discourse community, the more that you act and think like that discourse community. And so you might change your behaviors, your beliefs, and these other types of things based on the membership you have in your discourse community. So that's something that you're going to want to uncover and figure out when you interview professionals in your field. For instance, when I taught middle school and high school in a very small town, I had to dress a certain way, I had to act a very specific way in the classroom. If I went out and I was at the local pub and I saw students' parents, I would get up and leave because I didn't want to be, you know, drinking around them. The discourse community I was a part of made me act, even in my personal life, very differently than I had before. So these kinds of things can happen depending on what discourse community you join. So in order to find all this information out, you're going to need to do a few things. One, you're going to need to meet with the librarian to discover the database systems, journals, any types of sites that you're